Pete, tell me when I should go.
You can go anytime. The recording has started. So.
Cool, thanks. Well, thanks everybody for coming to Colloquium at an off time. I'm very delighted to introduce Helen Johnson from the University of Oxford. That's partly the reason why we have an off time, is because there's a time zone difference between here and the UK. Helen received her her BS in physics and meteorology, as well as her PhD in physical oceanography from the University of Reading. After a brief postdoc at Reading, she then moved to the University of Victoria. That's the one in Canada, not Australia, for a postdoctoral fellowship with Chris Garrett. After a few years there, she moved back to Reading as a Royal Society University Research Fellow, and then from there to the University of Oxford as a fellow and a lecturer, and she's been there ever since. I'm also particularly delighted to announce that as of last week, Helen has been promoted to full professor, and I just learned that she's the third full professor in physical oceanography who is a woman in the UK, which is quite an achievement, and is I'm very happy to hear that. So she's won a number of fellowships and awards. She supervised many postdocs, PhD, and master's students, and she and her group have published a long list of papers, mostly on Atlantic flavored oceanography, with some Southern Ocean flavored oceanography in there as well. A lot of topics. The papers are on the atmosphere's role in forcing the AMOC, so that's the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, and mechanisms for AMOC processes. I met Helen, I think it was the last US Cliver AMOC science team meeting, and as a personal aside, one of the things I really loved about those meetings is just how collegial and interactive those meetings are, and how many women there are at the established scientist level who are helping lead those discussions, Helen being one of them. So without further ado, take it away, Helen. I'm excited to hear about your talk on Labrador Sea ventilation.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks for the invitation. It's really nice to be able to talk to you guys. Obviously, it'll be lovely to visit in person sometime, but thanks for giving me the opportunity to share some science in these kind of strange times. Let me try and share my screen. Beautiful screen. I'm trusting that someone will shout if they can't see that.
Okay.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about some work that was led by my previous PhD student, Graham McGilchrist, when he was a PhD student with us in Oxford. He's now a postdoc at GFDL and Princeton. And what we've been doing over the last year is wrapping up some of the final bits of his thesis for publication. And so I'm going to talk today about the work we did on trying to get to grips with exactly where and when North Atlantic deep water is ventilated. So where is this deep water mass that fills much of the Atlantic, between about 1 and 3 kilometers? Where does that leave the surface mixed layer, and what governs the variability in that process? And so these two figures on the first slide are basically teasers for the where and the when. So I'll come back to both of those figures later. But I wanted to start by just providing a bit of background and motivation. So the first thing to say probably is that the North Atlantic is a key place for ocean ventilation, and that's because not only do isopycnals outcrop from the deep ocean to the surface in this region, but also there's a mechanism for exporting that water that's exchanged between the atmosphere and the deep ocean southwards in the form of the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the AMOC. So there's deep branch of the AMOC, the southward flow on the western side of the Atlantic, can take newly formed deep waters in this region southward and throughout the rest of the Atlantic. And so this combination makes the North Atlantic ocean ventilation process important, both for mean climate and also for the response to anthropogenic forcing. So the two figures I'm showing here, the one on the left, this is the estimated age of Labrador Sea Water, so water that last saw the surface in the Labrador Sea and resides throughout most of the Atlantic, more than 1 kilometre down. And this is deduced from CFC measurements over the last few decades. And you can see that the water moves eastwards and southwards, largely on the west side of the basin. And you can see it takes 3 to 4 decades to get down to kind of subtropical and lower latitudes. The figure on the bottom right shows you the column inventory of anthropogenic carbon dioxide. And I include this just to show that the Atlantic punches above its weight in terms of area, in terms of taking up anthropogenic carbon dioxide. And that's because of this ventilation process going on at high latitudes. It's also important for heat uptake. And the figure I've chosen to illustrate that is this one. This is slightly out of date now. It's based on CMIP3 data. I could have shown a Jose paper on CMIP5, and there's probably CMIP6 paper 2 now. But this one makes the point, and also makes the point that there's quite a lot of spread in the way models represent ocean ventilation. And so on the top left, this shows you the model mean climatological maximum mixed layer depth. So the maximum throughout the year at each location, and then that's averaged across the model ensemble. And you can see these deep surface mixed layers in the high latitudes. The figure on the right shows you the standard deviation in this this value, and you can see that that's really large. And modelers tend to use mixed layer depth as a proxy for ocean ventilation. I'm going to go on to show you that I don't think that's a particularly good idea. But nevertheless, you can see from this that there is a large spread in the way that models represent ocean ventilation. And that if you look at the bottom, so on the x-axis here, we've got kind of mixed layer depth in polar latitudes. That's what the little p stands for. And on the y-axis, there's a measure of deep ocean heat uptake. And you can see that this difference between models matters for the heat uptake that they simulate. So I said that one of the key messages is going to be that mixed layer depth isn't necessarily a good proxy for ocean ventilation. And the reason for that is because ocean ventilation is a fundamentally Lagrangian process. So it requires us to subduct water below the surface mixed layer, but it also requires us to keep that water down there and retain it in the subsurface. And that generally involves moving it somewhere where it's not at risk of being entrained back into the surface mixed layer when it deepens the next time. And so so we know, for example, that that variability in atmospheric conditions affects the ocean surface mixed layer, but we don't really know how that is translated into the ocean interior. So the top figure here shows you mixed layer properties, so mixed layer temperature, potential temperature in the Labrador Sea. And you can see the mixed layers deepening through the early 2000s here. So you can see that there's variability that comes from atmospheric forcing here, but we really don't know how much of that is subsequently reflected in what ends up throughout the basin in the ocean interior, and that's what we were trying to get at in this study. The bottom half of this slide kind of illustrates one of the key things we kind of had in mind during this process. We came at this having thought a little bit about the subtropical thermocline, where we know that there is a phenomenon active called a Stommel's mixed layer demon. This is the point where, if we were in a room, I'd be able to ask how many of you have heard of Stommel's mixed layer demon. But that's harder on this format, so I'll plow on. But do shout if anything's not clear. So Stommel's mixed layer demon is basically telling us, or it's an explanation for the fact that the properties in the subtropical thermocline correspond to those in the late winter surface mixed layer rather than an annual mean. And that's because it's only water that gets out of that surface mixed layer in the late winter within the subtropical thermocline that stays out of the mixed layer and doesn't get gobbled back up as the density outcrops move southwards again as the winter during the winter. So you can imagine, so the coloured panels here are from a paper by Rick Williams et al, where they seeded the particles leaving the mixed layer with a kind of date tracer corresponding to the month, and they looked at the water on 3 different isopictals, looked at this date tracer, and you can see that while water leaves the mixed layer throughout the year, the only stuff that stays down there after the migration of the outcrops of these density surfaces is the green and blue stuff that left in late winter. So that's mixed layer demon. That's the subtropical thermocline works. And I guess we came at this thinking, is something similar going on at high latitudes? In some ways, you might think it is. As the mixed layer shallows, you leave water behind in the deep ocean. Provided that can move away, then it's permanently subducted into the ocean surface. We might say ventilated. But the isopycnal outcrops don't move in such a nice, neat, marching north and south fashion in the subpolar regions. So that was one question. And then the other question was, is something similar to this going on interannual timescales? Might you imagine that there are some years which are more successful in ventilating the ocean interior than others for similar reasons? So they were our kind of more GFD motivations behind this work, if you like. And then before I dive in and tell you what we actually did, just for context, I wanted to show this ISNAP slide just to make the point that this is part of a broader effort within our group here in Oxford to understand the differences between overturning, deep water formation and ocean ventilation. So for those who don't know, the Overturning in the Subpolar North Atlantic programme is an international observing campaign to measure the strength of the overturning circulation in the subpolar North Atlantic. It actually consists of two measurement arrays, one across the kind of mouth of the Labrador Sea and one from the tip of Greenland across to Scotland. And what OSNAP has been doing is making estimates of the strength of the overturning circulation in density space across that line. And the first results, the first 2 years or so of data are shown here. So this is the amount of water flowing northwards relatively light that's transformed to denser water before it flows back south across that same section. So we use density space overturning up here because a lot of the dense water doesn't necessarily come back. The isopycnals are tilted across the subpolar ocean in a way that they're not across the subtropical ocean. So, so what this is showing us, the black line here, is showing us the over the first 21 months of the measurement campaign. It's showing you the amount of water mass transformation from upper ocean light water to deep ocean dense water that's happening north of this line. So strength of the overturning in density space, and you can see that there's considerable variability. It's a mean somewhere around 15 to 17 sphere drops. Not that dissimilar to the subtropical ocean, and quite a lot of variability. But the key result from this is to look at the blue line, which shows you that much water mass transformation is happening on the eastern side of Greenland. That's what the blue line gives you. The yellow line gives you the water mass transformation that's happening beyond this OSNAP west line across the Labrador Sea. What this is saying is that much of the water mass transformation and its variability is happening east of Greenland. And so one of the things we've been trying to do is kind of reconcile this view with the idea that we know that the Labrador Sea is important in ventilating much of the ocean interior. How do these two just fit together? So I'm not sure I'm going to 100% answer that in this talk, but that's part of a broader effort that's motivating. So what do we actually do then? Well, the questions I'm going to address today are when, where and how does ventilation of North Atlantic deep water happen? And how is variability in atmospheric forcing communicated into the ocean interior? And we've taken, in essence, quite a simple approach to this. We've just tagged every water parcel within the North Atlantic deep water in an eddy-permitting forced ocean model simulation and tracked them backwards in time until they meet the surface mix layer, and then track of where and when they met that surface mix layer. So the model we've used for this, the simulation, is it's an Orca 025 simulation. So it's a 1/4 degree resolution, forced ocean and sea ice simulation. It's run by the Drakkar project. It's actually a 57-year simulation, but there's no spin-up preceding that, and so we tend to only use the data from 1976. It's initialized from climatology, and we perform our trajectory analysis using the Ariane trajectory toolbox through 5-day mean velocity fields. So the first thing I have to show you is the water mass that we track backwards. So what is the model's North Atlantic deep water? And the reason I include this slide is because it's not exactly the same definition as the observational North Atlantic deep water definition, and that's because the model's hydrography differs somewhat from observations. But hopefully this slide will convince you that this is a sensible thing to do. So in the top right here, this shows you the surface density. So you can see all the isopycnal outcrops, and the ones marked out in black are the ones that are within our North Atlantic deep water range. You can see that they outcrop around, well, within the Labrador Sea and around the boundary of the Nordic seas. The second panel here, the pale grey histogram, shows you it's basically a histogram of the entire density distribution within the North Atlantic. Okay, so in 2015, at the end of the model run, what's the density distribution look like? It doesn't go less dense than 27, just starts at 27 neutral density, and you can see that there are these two peaks, one here and one here. The darker grey histogram shows you the similarly the density distribution, but only of the water that was ventilated during the model's run, so during the kind of 50 years of the simulation. So we track the particles backwards through time, and this is only the ones that made it to the surface mixed layer during that time. And you can see that those ones that are ventilated on these kind of 50-year timescales basically all sit within, or mostly sit within this density range that I'm going to call North Atlantic deep water. There is another peak in the model, and this is stuff that is not ventilated within 50 years, and this is southern sourced water that's been around longer and is denser, as you might expect. The final little piece of evidence that this is the right volume of water to consider is the one in the bottom left, and that shows the overturning stream function in depth space throughout the Atlantic, late winter mean, and it has the kind of bounding isopycnals on it. And you can see that this volume that they enclose basically represents the southward flowing branch of the overturning circulation. So hopefully you're happy that my model's North Atlantic deep water is, we've identified that correctly. Now we've tagged every parcel in that and tracked it back in time. So by way of a sanity check, the figure on the left shows you the age distribution of, I think this is depth median age distribution. Or based on this definition of North Atlantic deep water. Again, you can see that the water leaves the surface up here in the high latitudes, spreads eastward and southward, and then relatively confined to the western side of the basin, propagates southwards. The timescales are very similar to what we see from observations. The white bits on this plot are just regions that haven't been ventilated yet within the timescale of this run. It just takes longer for North Atlantic deep water to get to those regions. And on the right, this shows you a zonally averaged view as well of the water mass age calculated from these trajectories. It's worth saying that the unventilated bits, the white bits, are just ignored in the average. So this is kind of definitely biased young. Okay, so seems to be doing sensible things that agree with relatively well with CFC measurements. So let's move on to think about when North Atlantic deep water is ventilated. So this figure shows you, there's a colour bar down here, shows you the month of subduction. So for what's plotted at each pixel here is the month at which the North Atlantic deep water in that pixel left the surface mixed layer. So it doesn't say anything about where that leaving of the surface mixed layer happened. It just tells you when. And you can see that just like in the subtropical thermocline, all this North Atlantic deep water seems to have left, or most of it seems to have left the surface mixed layer in the kind of late winter, springtime. What's shown at the bottom here is the distribution of kind of months when it left the mixed layer, and the dashed line shows you how much of the ocean had its maximum mixed layer depth in any given month. And you can see that there's a bit of about a month lag between the two, for reasons that we're still exploring. But some of the next few slides will shed some light on that. Okay, so we talked about where. So I should talk about when in a seasonal sense anyway, and it's, as in the subtropical thermocline, it's late winter. Let's think about where. So where is this water leaving the surface mixed layer? And that's what this figure here shows you. It shows you over the course of the run how much North Atlantic deep water leaves from each of these locations. So this is a volume measure of how much of the water that subsequently fills the interior of the Atlantic left the surface mixed layer at these locations. And you can see that this is perhaps at first sight a bit of a surprising picture. So in the bottom right, this shows you the mixed layer depth. So you're already seeing some clues as to why I don't think mixed layer depth is necessarily a good proxy for ocean ventilation. You can see that the region, like many models, the region with the deepest mixed layers is largely in the Labrador Sea interior here and spreading out beyond. And that's not where most of the ventilation is happening, the permanent ventilation, the water that stays down there and makes its way into the North Atlantic deep water reservoir, if you like. What's happening instead, and you can see this if you look at the bottom left, is that the subduction is happening as the water flows around the western side of the Labrador Sea in a boundary current. So this is the barotropic stream function, and you can see the boundary current here flowing around the edge of the basin, and it's in this boundary current that this ventilation seems to be happening. And that, when you actually stop to think about it, might not actually be that surprising. We've said that ventilation is a Lagrangian process. It doesn't just require you to be left behind when the mixed layer shallows. It also requires you to move out of the way so that when the mixed layer deepens again, you don't get gobbled up. And there's this boundary current provides a good mechanism for exporting that water southward so that it's out of the way of the region of deep mixed layers by the time the next winter or the subsequent storm comes along and can deepen the mixed layer again. And so that was our first kind of interesting conclusion. So to put some numbers on that, so I think the next slide. So this shows you the cumulative amount of ventilation as a function of model Z level or depth. And you can see that about 72% of the ventilation happens over bathymetry shallower than 3,000 meters. Only 28% happens in what we would call the open ocean, so greater than 3 kilometers deep. Okay. Now, I'm going to pick apart these figures in a bit more detail now. And so I've got one figure that basically combines all the information from all three of these plots, which may be too much, but I'll talk you through it. So on the left-hand side here, the size of the dots show you how much water was subducted. The colour of the dot shows you the mixed layer depth, late winter mixed layer depth, and the dots themselves are sampled along streamlines of the barotropic stream function. Okay. And the reason I've done this is to look at how water leaves the surface mixed layer. So there's basically three ways that can happen. So it can either happen through convergences within the surface mixed layer, which lead to vertical velocities across the mixed layer. It can happen through, as we've said, being left behind when the mixed layer shallows. Or it can happen via lateral fluxes across a sloping mixed layer base. And we think this is what's going on here. So if you look in the top corner of the Labrador Sea, within this model simulation, there are deep mixed layers here in this region of dark blue. And then the boundary current flows on into a region of much shallower mixed layers, associated, of course, with freshwater export through the Canadian archipelago. But the mixed layer shallows significantly here, and this is where the subduction is happening. This is where the dots get big, and lots of the water, North Atlantic deep water, is being permanently sequestered in those regions. You can see that in more detail in the two figures on the right, where what we've done is we've unwrapped the barotropic streamline, starting at the southern tip of Greenland and flowing around the basin in this direction. So there's a couple of numbers here just to orient you. This is distance along the streamline on the x-axis here. And the top panel shows you mixed layer depth along each streamline. The bottom panel shows you the ventilated volume at that location. And you can see that whilst in general it's clear this is true, as the mixed layer deepens here, there's very little ocean ventilation, and it's where the mixed layer shallows that the ventilation happens. If you actually look in more detail at specific streamlines, pick out a particular colour and look at it, you can see that it's not just in generic large-scale terms that that's true, but you can see it happening in the details as well. You even see a bit of it along here by the Grand Banks, where mixed layers shallow again, and you shallow again here, and you can see this another pulse of ventilation there. So that's what seems to be going on in this model simulation. And I'm just going to go back briefly to this figure here to say that actually that might also be what's going on with this chunk of ventilation in the open ocean too, because if you notice the barotropic stream function down in the bottom left, that has a recirculation here. So the flow actually is kind of northerly in this region and is crossing from deep mixed layers into shallow mixed layers again. So this might be a component of what's going on in the open ocean as well. Okay, so that's where is North Atlantic deep water ventilated, primarily in the Labrador Sea boundary current. It's not surprising necessarily to us, or it's not new that ventilation can, or subduction can happen within the Labrador Sea boundary currents. But what we've tended to think of, often what we've tended to think of in the past, is that lighter waters, so lighter components of North Atlantic deep water, perhaps lighter Labrador Sea water, might subduct over the boundary current, and denser water might subduct over the ocean interior. And so this figure is an attempt to probe that. And the dashed lines show you the distribution of densities at the time of leaving the mixed layer. And so the green one is in the boundary current effectively, and the purple one is in the open ocean. And you can see that it is true that in the boundary current, the water which leaves the mixed layer is less dense than the water that leaves the mixed layer in the open ocean. But that by the time you just consider the volume of North Atlantic deep water throughout the basin in the run, there must be significant subsurface transformation, because the solid lines show you that by the end of the run, the water mass, you can't tell really by density where water came from, where it left the surface mixed layer. So I'm not going to say much about this. We've been down something of a rabbit hole working out what's going on with subsurface water mass transformation, and it turns out that it takes place, much of it anyway, takes place due to interaction with parameterized vertical mixing near the bottom boundary. And so lots of the trajectories encounter the bottom boundary, where the NEMO model has an elevated kappa, and you can show that along trajectories they experience these hotspots, which adds up to significant additional transformation. And so the point I want to make here is just that as a result of that, so ventilation across the whole North Atlantic deep water density range arises from subduction in both the boundary current and the open ocean. Obviously, there's lots of things here that one could pick apart. One could talk about how realistic this is. There's clearly, obviously, going to be some numerical mixing as well as this explicit parameterized mixing. There's the possibility that the Lagrangian advection scheme is not conserving density as it should. So we've explored many of these, and we're secure in saying that this is a key component, but by no means necessarily the only one. The other, let me go back 1 second. The other key thing I should address that the eagle-eyed of you may have spotted is that very little of this ventilation happens in the Nordic seas. This well-known region of dense water formation, and this region that's basically east of Greenland, as identified by OSNAP as an important water mass transformation region. So very little of the water that leaves the mixed layer in this region ends up permanently ventilating the Atlantic in this model simulation. And so just have one slide to explain why that is. What we did to get at this was some forward in time trajectories where we initialized particles, if you like, at every point within the Nordic seas below the mixed layer. So not just ventilated points now, but at the whole volume of the Nordic seas below the mixed layer. And we ran those trajectories forward in time. And this panel at the top shows you where that water, and the amount of water, in fact, that was re-entrained into the mixed layer. Okay. The information is synthesized in the panel on the left, and this shows you what fraction of those trajectories remain at any given latitude, remain subsurface below the mixed layer at any given latitude. And you can see that by the time you get to about 40, 45 north, you're down to less than 10% of the water that leaves the mixed layer in the Nordic seas in this model actually makes it south of here. And the reason for that is because it is, much of it, almost all of it, re-entrained to the mixed layer, either locally within the Nordic Sea, so it doesn't escape, it's subsequently re-entrained the following winter or whenever, or it's re-entrained during the water's transit through the Labrador Sea in these regions of deep mixed layers. And you can see that the reason that happens, the reason it's possible for water to be re-entrained in the Labrador Sea is because of subsurface transformation of density. So the bar graph at the bottom in the dark green, that's the initial density of the particles, the histogram of the initial density of these particles, and then the paler green shows you the density of the particles when they're re-entrained into the mixed layer, wherever that happens. And you can see that that the density has changed significantly, and that now it's very much within this Labrador Sea, this density range that we've been talking about, 27.7 to 28, that is formed and goes on to characterize the North Atlantic deep water. And so what's going on here is deep water formed in the Nordic seas is flowing out through the overflows. We know that overflows struggle to get these kind of things right in numerical models. It's being overflowed probably into a lighter density class, which is then able to be accessed by the deep mixed layers in the Labrador Sea. And so this water is re-entrained to the mixed layer. Now, there's lots that can be said about this. And I think what I'm going to say is that you at first thought this might seem inconsistently with the OSNAP measurements, which are telling us that all the important water mass transformation for the overturning is happening over here. So we looked in this model at the overturning in density space, and that's what's shown in the top here. This is the equivalent of the earlier figure I showed you, which was in depth space. It's the same thing, just plotted with density on the y-axis here. And so you can see water flowing northwards, relatively light, and then being transformed to dense water in the high latitudes, and then flowing southwards at heavier densities. And if you look at this, you can see that most of the water mass transformation is happening north of about 62 north. It's all happening in here, which is consistent with OSNAP results, and it's poleward of the major subduction regions that we identified with our Lagrangian analysis. Okay. And what that's doing really is it's helping us to make this distinction between ventilation and dense water formation or overturning. So it's possible, of course, for water to be made only marginally denser during its transit of the Labrador Sea, but to nevertheless be refreshed and ventilated via contact with the atmosphere. So we've always known that warm water goes, very warm, salty water, this is actually salinity, goes northwards across the OSNAP line on the eastern side of the array and loses its buoyancy and is transformed to colder, denser water, which comes back out of the Nordic seas, not necessarily much deeper, but comes back as a denser water mass. And then that water mass can be made denser in the Labrador Sea, even if the majority of the water mass transformation has happened over OSNAP East. That does not preclude it having its density modified as it transits the Labrador Sea. And that modification process exposes the, provided that the mixed layers can punch down into this water mass, exposes that water back to the atmosphere. Now, there's lots of repercussions of this process for traces. For example, you might want to think about things like, well, what's important, I suppose, is the equilibration timescale of traces. So we're starting to think about what this means for oxygen content and carbon content and where that really is set. You know, if this process were going on, is the water, when it's reventilated in the Labrador Sea, is it able to equilibrate in terms of traces? Which traces is it able to equilibrate in? So is it still true that it's in the Nordic seas that's setting most of the carbon content of these waters, or is there a role for the Labrador Sea in that? How is that process happening? So that's just a taster, I suppose, of what we're thinking about, starting to think about now at the moment. But this isn't, so our results are not inconsistent at all with the OSNAP picture. And of course, this model we're fairly sure is overmixing and the overflows. And so shouldn't consider this as necessarily an accurate portrayal of reality. Although I think it's true to say that we really don't know the extent to which some of this water is reentrapped in the Labrador Sea fully. Okay, so I'm going to move on now and spend the last little bit of the talk talking about variability in North Atlantic deep water ventilation. So this is the when. I'm going to focus on interannual variability. And so to do this, the grey bars here show an average age distribution of North Atlantic deep water model. And so we've done this by tagging all the particles at the end of every year and following them backwards in time. So we have a sense for, on average, how much 20-year-old water is there, how much 30-year-old water is there, if you average over a bunch of years. And you can see that there's quite a lot of water that's less than a year old. That drops off significantly because a lot of it is re-entrained during that first year. And then there's a slight decrease, continues to be a slight decrease. That's partly due to continuing re-entrainment, and it's partly due to water leaving across the boundaries of the domain we consider, which I think goes to more 30 south and I can't remember, 80 north, I think. So that's what gives us this shape, the average age distribution. What asterisks show here is the age distribution of the North Atlantic deep water in 2015. Okay. And so you can see, for example, that in 2015 there was an anomalously large amount of 20-year-old water, which is telling us that in 1995 there was an anomalous amount of ocean ventilation into North Atlantic deep water. Okay. And so what we've done is that we've subtracted the average age distribution from the 2015 age distribution and then normalized by the average age distribution. And that's what's shown in the grey bars at the bottom. And this is what I'm going to call my ventilation variability. So a value of 1 here in 1995 is telling us that there's twice as much water ventilated in that year as there is on average. Twice as much 20-year-old water. And so those of you who are used to staring at climate time series might see their favourite time series in this. Again, things that I would be asking for contributions if we were all in one room, but I'll carry on. That same time series chopped off a little bit so that to make sure we're using the bit of the run that corresponds to the spin up, excuse me, is repeated in orange here at the top. And in the red and blue bars is the NAO. So DJFM, I think, annual mean, DJFM NAO, which many of you be familiar with looking at. And you can see that, you know, broad brush strokes, it captures some of the kind of decade to decade variability in ocean ventilation. No surprise there. We know that atmospheric forcing associated with the NAO is important for ocean ventilation. It determines the strengths and the positions of the wind stress and therefore latent heat fluxes, as well as atmospheric temperatures. The black confirms that. This is the kind of mixed layer volume anomaly, and you can see that corresponds quite well actually to the NAO. Okay. But closer inspection of the orange time series here shows that actually the NAO is not all. You can see that the NAO was high throughout these early 1990s, but it's only really the end of this period that there were significant anomalies in ventilation. The same is true more recently up here, 2 years with high NAO. It's only in the most recent year. Same here as well. So So there's definitely something else going on. And it's actually not, again, you know, I worry that these results are actually not at all novel when I present it like this, but what's going on is just that there is this re-entrainment the following year, which and it's variability in re-entrainment which is playing a large role in setting what remains in the interior and what we call the ventilation, what stays there as part of North Atlantic deep water. Hopefully this figure will make that point. The white bars here are just the same as the orange time series, slightly different time frame again. The black bars are the amount of subduction, so the amount that left the mixed layer in the first year. So there's no requirement in the black bars for it to actually stay down there. It's just how much leaves the mixed layer in any given year. The white stuff is the stuff that doesn't come back up. And you can see that it sort of makes sense that at the end of a period where you've had deep mixed layers, you've produced a lot of subduction every year, you've left a lot of dense water behind as the mixed layer is shallowed. It's only when at the end of this period, when the mixed layer doesn't deepen as much, that you actually have a significant peak in water that stays in the ocean interior, a ventilation anomaly. And so what I'm saying here is that it's actually not the variability in the atmospheric forcing that's generating the subduction, but the variability in the amount that's retained that is leading to variability in ocean ventilation. And of course, that is still related to the NAO. So this is the same figure as the previous slide, but what it does is it breaks things down into whether they're happening in the open ocean or in the boundary current. So let's focus on the bottom two panels here. So again, the dark colours are the amount that's subducted below the base of the mixed layer in any given year. And the light colours are the ones that remain there after re-entrainment. But the green bars tell you about what's going on in the boundary current, so shallower than 3,000 metres. And the purple bars tell you about what's going on in the open ocean. And so you can see, if you look at this, you know, just look at the y-axes and the size of the bars, that most of the variability, you can see it up here too, whilst most of the ventilation is happening in the Labrador Sea boundary current, the variability set by the open ocean. It's the purple, at least recently, that's contributed more to the variability rather than the green. And again, you can see it's this re-entrainment process that is leading to that variability. And so in a more kind of more familiar sense, it's this process of mixed layers deepening, shallowing, deepening, shallowing, and then perhaps not deepening quite so much. It's that variability in the amount that you leave behind in the deep ocean in regions where water isn't being exported as rapidly that's giving us variability in ventilation, and that's happening in the open ocean. So there's this tension between kind of an effective timescale to get the water away and a mixed layer deepening timescale that's related to the NAO. Okay, I just have 2 more slides. Do I have time, Liz? Shall I? I haven't got a clock here.
Yes, it's 10:15. If you've got another 5 minutes, that should be about right.
Awesome, thank you. So just 2 more things I wanted to show. So this shows you at the top here, rather than breaking down our ventilated volume by where, in terms of boundary current and interior, where it was ventilated. What I've done here is take the time series and break it down in terms of its density, the density that it was ventilated into. Okay, and so you can see now that, you know, in the early part of this period, water was being ventilated into relatively dense part of North Atlantic deep water, and in more recent years, water has been ventilated into kind of shallower density, not shallower, lighter density classes. Lighter density classes, and then lighter density classes in later years. The reason I like this that Graham put together recently is that what's shown at the bottom is something that's completely independent of this. So this top panel is calculated from our trajectories. The bottom panel is calculated, it's just a surface force water mass transformation calculation from the Eulerian model fields, so it just uses surface densities and surface fluxes. And you can see that despite the subsurface transformation that we know that's going on, the the atmospheric forcing associated with the NAO does leave an imprint in the ocean interior. You can see, I mean, again, in the details, there's differences associated with this advective contribution to ventilation. But you do see, based on surface water mass transformation, you could make some predictions on what the volume of North Atlantic deep water looks like in terms of its density characteristics. So that was quite nice. And then the final thing, so this is more a hint, I suppose, of what we'd like to do with this. And that was, you know, of course, can we make a link between variability in North Atlantic deep water ventilation and variations in AMOC strength? So this is, I mean, this is the figure I showed at the beginning with a different color scale. So this is the age of North Atlantic deep water. And what's shown on the right, so this is latitude on the y-axis, and age here, is going to look at that kind of average latitude of waters that were ventilated during high and low ventilation years. And so waters that were ventilated during high ventilation years do seem to make it further south than waters that were ventilated during low ventilation years. Might say there's not a lot in it, and we haven't probed the statistics here very much yet, but and there's a lot of spread, but there's a hint that there is some link to the kind of larger basis scale kind of overturning variations. Okay, so I will wrap up. So these are my conclusions then. Hopefully I've convinced you that ocean ventilation is fundamentally Lagrangian. So you can't just rely on getting water out of the surface mixed layer, you also have to retain it below the mixed layer, and that usually means exporting it somewhere. So mixed layer depth is not always a good proxy for ocean ventilation. I think you could do, well, let me go back briefly. You could do interesting things by looking at the change in mixed layer depth from year to year. So this is what Graham's been playing with, and this is the dashed line here. So this is ventilation anomaly reconstructed from mixed layer anomalies in the current year and the next year. So it's like an AR1 process, but rather than knowing the year that the past year, it knows about the next year. And actually it does a really good job. So if you know from year to year what the mixed layer depth is going to be in the next year, then you can have a reasonable stab at your ventilation, which is quite interesting. The ventilation is predominantly happening due to subduction in the Labrador Sea boundary current. In this model, not much of it comes from the Nordic seas due to subsurface mixing and re-entrainment back into the mixed layer as it transits through the Labrador Sea. So the water may have come originally from the Nordic seas, but it's in this model sees the surface again in the Labrador Sea on its way south, and so its age, if you like, ventilation characteristics get reset. And one can argue about whether that's true, what traces that's true of. It's certainly true of an age tracer, but might not be true of other traces. Variability in ventilation is driven by atmospheric forcing changes related to the NAO, substantially influenced by these year-to-year variations in subsurface retention in the Labrador Sea interior. And there's lots of subsurface transformation actually in the model's North Atlantic deep water volume, and that's a result of mixing, particularly explicit mixing in the model's bottom boundary layer in this 1/4 degree model. And yet, despite this, we do see that temporal variations in the density structure of water that's formed by surface buoyancy loss are retained into the ocean interior. This is a picture of Graham, for those who haven't met him. So he takes all the credit for this work. I take any responsibility for misrepresenting what he's done. It's been really fun. I have one paper that's just come out this month in Journal of Climate. That's on the time mean stuff, kind of where are things ventilated. And then the time dependence paper is in an advanced stage of preparation and hopefully be submitted before Christmas. So I will leave it there. Thanks very much.
I'll clap over here since we have this wonderfully awkward setup. So thank you very much for the nice talk. The beeping you're hearing is all of the virtual claps that are starting up.
Oh, lovely.
I'd like to first open the floor to any student questions. And I'm going to do that awkward thing where I stare into the void and wait until a student gives me a question. That's what they teach you. At least that's what they taught me in TA training 8 or 9 years ago. Yep, I'm doing that awkward. I'm waiting. Anne.
Hi, thanks for that great talk. I had a question about your figures on the variability. So it seemed like the correlation between the NAO and the variability was a lot more noticeable in the recent years. And it seemed like the first part of your time series, like the 1960s to the 1980s, did not seem as related. Do you think there's a physical explanation for that, or is it from the model spin up? Just do you have any thoughts on that? So I don't know if it was this plot or a couple slides later.
This one. Yeah, so I would, so the model starts in 1958, but there's no spin-up. So we tend to, sorry, I should, which is why the other things start in 1975. I should probably have covered that, blank those out. I wouldn't pay too much attention to the 60s okay. and first half of the 70s, yeah.
Did Ian have a question?
Yeah, hi, thank you very much for the talk. I just had I guess it might just be a clarification, but early on you showed a slide and it had two distributions. One of them had a peak at a higher density threshold than the ventilated densities, which showed a peak at lower density. And I was just wondering if the light gray was showing, yes, it's B there. The light gray was showing the whole ocean, because you mentioned there's a southern contribution, or if that was just the North Atlantic.
Yeah, so it's showing, so the difference here, so the domain we consider, so it's a global run, but the domain we consider is just the Atlantic, so from 30 south, or 35 south to 80 north, or something like that. But the grey considers that whole volume, whereas the dark grey considers only the stuff that saw the surface in the last 50 years. And all the stuff that saw the surface in the last 50 years basically came from the North Atlantic, and we can think of as North Atlantic deep water, whereas some of the other water that's in there as well has come from the Southern Ocean on longer time scales than the 50 years, generally.
Sure, and so the values in that secondary peak in the light gray, actually the largest peak, those haven't been ventilated, like they didn't make it to the surface?
No, so they will have left the surface around Antarctica more than 50 years ago, I think. This is the southern source, okay. Antarctic bottom water, basically.
Yeah, I see.
So it's
great, thank you very much.
It may have crossed the southern boundary of our domain. I forget exactly how we characterize them for this, but I think it's true to say that they haven't seen the surface in the last 50 years, or the boundary of our domain.
Cool, thank you.
I'll open up the floor to any questions. Claire.
Hi, that was a great talk. It was really interesting. I had a question about the relationship between the NAO to what you're seeing in the variation, and specifically, how much are you able with the model to attribute, like how much is direct atmospheric forcing versus like how much could be secondary? And what I mean by that is, like in Greenland, there's a lot of studies now that show negative NAO may be increasing the amount of melt. So like how much could possibly be fresh water, like capping the surface where you're not getting ventilation, or just wondering like if those can be separated, or if you've thought about that, or kind of the status of that.
So that's a great question, because I think that's where this work is useful. I think because, I'm going to go back, sorry, because the where's it gone? Because yeah, now that we understand a bit more about where the ventilation is happening, then it throws all these other mechanisms into the light, like the variations in the amount of export of fresh water, which will change these gradients in mixed layer depth in these regions. and have the potential to differ from year to year and be important. And so, so the answer is I don't know the answer, but you know, in this model simulation, we are finding that although most of the ventilation happens out here, most of the variability is set in here. And so I think it probably is direct forcing coming from wind stress and atmospheric temperatures, you know, latent and sensible heat fluxes. But I certainly think, you know, when thinking about the real ocean, then there's definitely a role to play for atmospherically driven changes in where the mixed layer depth shallows significantly along streams, definitely. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. And a lot of this, you know, NAO stuff, at least over Greenland, where I look at, is relatively new as well, and it's not necessarily known. Yeah. So I was just curious. Thanks.
I think next question's from Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. That was interesting. I'm curious if you've compared your model results to OSNAP in terms of east-west overturning, and if it shows the same dominance of the eastern transformation in density space. And related to that, I'm curious about the surface water mass transformation, if that was done over the entire subpolar gyre, or if you looked at that regionally and found out where the surface transformation is dominant.
So I think that was done over the entire North Atlantic for now. Yeah, because it was actually done quite a long time ago, the surface water mass transformation, before we had much clarity from the OSNAP results. But this shows you the comparison between this model and OSNAP. There are deficiencies, yeah, very much so. And so, yeah, so we're trying to view this as a study, kind of learning very much about the mechanisms rather than viewing this as truth. So the panels at the top here, so this is density structure along the OSNAP line. This is the 2015 annual mean from OSNAP at the top, and the one below is the model. And you can see that the model has a lot less mid-depth density. And this is basically this overmixing of the overflows, I think, which makes it easier then to convect deeply into this region. Because it's not got that stratification at mid-depth. And on the right-hand side, this is from EN4, and the same's going on in the climatology. So this is a 40-year EN4 climatology late winter mean, and this is the model mean over that same period. And again, you can see less stratification and an absence of the densest water masses coming out of the Nordic seas. So yeah, so there are deficiencies there, that's clear. In terms of the depth-weighted transport, you can see these here. So this is cumulative transport along the OSNAP section, which actually isn't too bad. And the bottom model versus overturning in density space. So density on the x-axis, transport here. So the grey bars is the basically the density range we're considering. Because we don't have the densest water masses, then obviously there's no overturning in the model in that range. So there are some deficiencies, but it's not terrible actually. You know, it does reasonably well overall. I think, you know, it doesn't have this. You know, the model has some overturning in the Labrador Sea, which OSNAP doesn't, but it does also have some in OSNAP in east of Greenland. So yeah, I don't know the answer really. I mean, we need to. Yeah, we're trying to be. I mean, it's basically about learning how models represent this process for us, and getting some clues as to what to look at in the real world. But
yeah, but it does look like the OSNAP West overturning the model is over represented, right? You've got over.
It is. Yeah,
like
it is
8
definitely.
Yeah. Compared to 2 or 3.
Yeah, but that's not at the expense of East. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. It's not at the expense of the East.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. I think Feng has a question next.
Yeah. Thank you, Helen. So my question is, so it's related to Steve's question. So in the model, what controls the location for the deep water formation? in the Labrador Sea and the Nordic Sea. So I'm fascinated by the fact that the model actually can reproduce the conventional idea that those two locations are the deep water formation region.
Sorry if I didn't get your question because you dropped out a little bit in the middle there.
Yeah, let me repeat.
I'm going to move to a plug.
So in the model, basically what controls the location for the two deep water formation region? One in the Labrador Sea, the other one is in the Nordic Sea.
So I think your question was what controls the two locations for deep water formation in the model?
Yes.
So we didn't look into that because we looked specifically at ventilation rather than deep water formation. So it depends a little bit what you mean by deep water formation. But you know, the sense I got from our comparisons with the NAO was that it's, you know, yeah, as we've talked about already, NAO related atmospheric forcing, wind stresses, you know, the location and the strength of those winds and the atmospheric temperatures associated with the NAO. But we didn't look in detail in this model, but you know, we didn't see anything to indicate that it was different to what other models suggest in that regard. Does that make sense? I guess we focused on the actual, we looked at it very much from the ocean side, so what stays down rather than how much water is transformed, with the exception of the surface forced transformation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think I have a question, but I think Helen and I are going to talk later this week, and I'll ask her then, since I'm pretty sure there's a meeting with between Helen and students now. I don't want to go into that time. So if we can thank Helen again, thank you for the great talk. I have a lot of questions, but I'll ask you some other time.
Thanks everyone.
Yeah, clap.
Really nice to talk to you all.